Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 16th episode in the ongoing series here on Farm Chatter, Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. In this episode, in this part of the series, which is returning after a few-week break, we move to the Americas to discuss the Inquisition in the Americas. So there's been a number of episodes in the series about the Papal Inquisition, which is the pre-quote-unquote Spanish Inquisition, and then we discussed the Spanish Inquisition and how it operated in various parts of it. And now moving to South America, mainly during the 17th century, more discussed, but that's like one of the main events that we'll be discussing here. This is in Lima in Peru, and there was a large auto de fe there, unfortunately. And just to mention, this episode is unfortunately in some ways more relevant with the current terrible situation going on in Eretz Yisrael. So this episode then moves to the Americas to discuss the Inquisition, again focusing on Peru, Lima, Peru, but again throughout the Americas. Then there will be another episode on just conversos, Marranos, new Christians, but conversos in the Americas and some of their stories. That will be another episode, and then the series will go on with the quote-unquote cherem, or lack of, on Spain and living in Spain. And then there's another episode, kind of a fascinating story, kind of a more modern tale, which you'll hear to close out the series, and I may be working on a finale episode just to keep you updated on what's going to be coming over the next couple of weeks as we wrap up the series on Spain. Of course, as I mentioned a number of times, there's a number of things that are missing from the series, which I know. Namely, I still hope to get to Kabbalah at some point. That hasn't been done. Disputations, I did not do. Philosophy was mentioned here and there. But again, I think the series, hopefully listeners enjoyed it and continue to enjoy it throughout the end. I think it was informative. That's the feedback I've gotten. It was educational. It was interesting. Again, it's just a massive, to pick a time period and a place which kind of Spain wasn't this unified kingdom, and we discussed Portugal, and then there was Muslim Spain and Christian Spain and so many different centuries, and now discussing the Sephardic diaspora, the Spanish Portuguese Jews, and the Americas and Inquisition, and there's just so much there. So naturally things are going to be left out, but hopefully this is something that you enjoyed. So that's where the series will be going, and like I said, there will be kind of a finale episode, and if anyone is interested if have any ideas for anything else, let me know. But basically, that's going to be more or less it as we transition with a look ahead to the next series here on Farm Chatter. As always, I would like to thank the corporate sponsor of the series, but a lot of this series, the Schaposchnik series, and the forthcoming series on the 10 Lost Tribes. So the corporate sponsor of the series, Gluck Plumbing, for all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines to a simple faucet leak. Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1, and tell them that you heard about them on Svarim Chatter. And thank them for sponsoring the episodes and making the series possible. If anyone else wants to sponsor an episode, which the cost is $360, as I mentioned a number of times, you can do so in the show's notes, Zelle, or Zelle, Chase, QuickPay. It's farmchatter@gmail.com, or PayPal. There's a link via PayPal, or any amount at all. Some listeners have done that. A number of episodes have been sponsored recently, and either way, I very much appreciate it. As you can hear from this, hopefully, kind of working on improving the audio quality of the podcast and some other things. So money does go towards helping that as well. The actual episode was recorded before that, so won't hear that, but in the intro. So hopefully, you appreciate that. If you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen, Apple, Spotify, 24/6. And if you can please rate and review, especially on Apple, very much appreciate it. And with that, enjoy the 16th episode of Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Anna Schaposchnik, who is an associate professor of history at DePaul University. And we are going to be discussing the Lima Inquisition and in general, South American Inquisitions at this part in the ongoing series on Spanish Jewry. And we've discussed the Inquisition and conversos, but not specifically the South American Inquisition. And Professor Schaposchnik wrote a book about the Lima Inquisition. It's actually titled, say the title now, Lima Inquisition, The Plight of Crypto Jews in 17th Century Peru. So that is something we'll explore on this episode. So thank you, Professor Schaposchnik, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so my name is Anna Schaposchnik, and I live in Chicago right now, but I am originally from Buenos Aires, Argentina. So this is where I was born and where I was raised, and also where I began my work. So I did my undergrad at the University of Buenos Aires in social anthropology, and I began working on an interdisciplinary field that is called ethnohistory, between anthropology and history. And at that time, my interest was in colonial Latin American history, and I began working with the Spanish conquest and Native American resistance to the Spanish conquest. But then over time, I wanted to shift topics and I wanted to work on different things. And one of those was when I learned about the existence of the Inquisition in colonial Latin America, which I never knew. I mean, I knew about Jewish history, but I had no idea that there was an Inquisition. So I began thinking about shifting topics. And by the time I moved to the US, I moved to the US to pursue an MA and a PhD. So I finished my MA with studies of Native American history and colonial period, but then I shifted to study the Inquisition and to study the presence of hidden Jews, crypto Jews, Marranos, these kind of populations in the colonial period. So that's more or less how I got here.
So, like you say, you were interested in the Inquisition. I mean, but how specifically did you get involved in the Lima Inquisition, Peru? You're not from Peru, South America. You're from Argentina. So how did you get specifically interested in that?
Because when you do colonial, this is from being a historian. The further back you go in time, the more fragmented is the information. So you follow the information. You don't design many things. So I wanted to do anything about Jewish history or crypto Jews or Marrino, knowing about the expulsion and the Inquisition and the colonial period. I wanted to do something about the Jews in the colonial period in South America. So at that time, there was a book that was fairly famous in Argentina that was done by a genealogist. And he argued that many of the initial settlers of Buenos Aires is my hometown. So his argument was that many of the initial settlers were Portuguese merchants who were in Buenos Aires because they were far from all the tribunals of the Inquisition. And he traced down the genealogy, but it's a book that has kind of the family trees and some information on any of them. So I know this book, and I talked to my advisor saying, okay, maybe I can do something about, social history or cultural history of these people. And I began looking at archival information, and I realized that is the paradox of hiding from a police force. So a policing body, if they were hiding, even though we may think that there is information to prove they were no Christians, perhaps crypto Jews, but if they were hiding, what kind of record was I going to study? There was no record because they were hiding. They're not going to leave a diary if they were hiding. So once I understood that, I realized that I have to follow the information, and the information to find these people is the one left by the tribunal, because the tribunal was, locating them, persecuting and prosecuting and writing the record. So after 6 months or a year, something like this, I met with one of the very many meetings with professors, and I met with my professor and I said, this is my conclusion. If I want, I either switch topic or switch location. But the historical information is not here. It's not in Buenos Aires. The conversation took place in the US, but the historical information is not about Buenos Aires. The historical information is about Lima. And he listened to me and he smiled and he said, I agree. I kind of thought that for a while, but I expected you to reach your own conclusion as a scholar. And it's true. And that's how I had to shift the location of my research. And instead of reading general information about colonial Buenos Aires, start reading general information about colonial Lima, and then organize the research based on the materials from the Inquisition.
So let's talk a little bit about colonial Lima to start. Before we even get into the Inquisition, I think it's good to explain. I assume listeners know where Peru is, but maybe explain where Peru is, when Spanish colony. Give like kind of the general geographic and background history of Lima and Peru, and then we can go a little bit more into the Inquisition.
Okay, so the city of Lima was established, and now I forgot. Of course, the date is now gone from my head, but the city of Lima was established in the 1530s or 40s, more or less, and it's a port on the Pacific. So this is the area that belonged to the Inca Empire before the arrival of the Spanish conquerors, but was not the capital of the Inca Empire. The capital of the Inca Empire was in Cusco. This is in the highlands. But the city of Lima was established in the 1530s.
1535, I see online.
Okay, I'm sorry. This specific. Everyone thinks that historians remember. A historian remembers all the dates, and it's not true. we have to double check the information to know the date because it happens. So I tell that to my students all the time. So I'm glad it happened here. So it was established in the 1530s, and it was the capital of the Viceroyalty. So this is the Viceroyalty of Peru, which occupied pretty much the entire surface of South America, with the exception of Brazil. So Peru now is a way smaller country, but at that time, the Viceroyalty of Peru was Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and then to the north, Ecuador, Colombia, and parts of Venezuela. So because the other part belonged to New Spain and probably part of Panama. So it was a gigantic bureaucratic jurisdiction. What the early Spanish colonization is organized into two viceroyalties. The Viceroyalty of New Spain, which is Mexico and pretty much the entire South America and the Spanish Caribbean. And then the Viceroyalty of Peru, which is the one that I just mentioned. So Lima was this bureaucratic, administrative center, political center, economic center. And because of that, it had all the tribunals. And the Inquisition is one of the many other royal tribunals. So that gives you a sense of location.
Right, and not Brazil, because Brazil was a Portuguese colony.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So you mentioned the tribunal, the Inquisition. So the Spanish Inquisition, founded in 1478. You can give a general overview of the Inquisition. Like I said, there's other episodes in the series, but if you want to just review things for our purposes, you do it nicely in the book. But and especially when you can give a general overview of it, and then when the Inquisition is established in Peru, in Lima.
So the Inquisition was established in Spain in 1478 as one of the requests to kind of protect the process of the conversos, to prevent the people who didn't convert to influence those who had converted in Spain. That was in 1478, or that's how they explain it, more or less. And the Inquisition is after, let's say, bad Christians. It's not after Jews. The Inquisition has no jurisdiction over people who had not converted. First, they need to convert either by will or by force, but first they need to be converted. So the Inquisition was established before Columbus' trip. And so by the time that the society crosses the Atlantic, first is Columbus and then colonization. So by the time they cross the Atlantic, this tribunal is part of life, is part of the society. And initially they established a series of regulations to control migration over the Atlantic. So there's no, I think, like free movement between one side to the other. They have requirements that you have to apply to that license to migrate, and it has to be approved by some sort of bureaucratic entity. And if you're approved to migrate, then you can, come to the colonies. But a part of the process is to provide information about blood purity, whether you had any ancestry, or whether you're all Christian, or you have any ancestry that comes from other Jews or Muslims. So initially, I think that the monarchy or the colonial powers don't anticipate the need for an Inquisition on this side of the Atlantic because they're preventing the arrival. But what comes, in different reports, they find that, conversos, people who are converted, are arriving to the colonies in different ways, whether they forge information in their applications, or whether they buy some sort of identity letters, so they take the identity of someone else, or whether they come from Portugal to Brazil, because the Portuguese didn't have a tribunal of the Inquisition in Brazil. So Brazil supposedly is a more open field in that sense. So whether they come from Portugal to Brazil, and then they cross, from Brazil to either Buenos Aires or to any other city of Spanish colonization. And these are all people who, if they're coming from Portugal, they are grandchildren of Spaniards. So they are the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of those who in 1492 chose exile to Portugal instead of conversion. And then they settled and they found themselves converted in Portugal. So there is a connection with Spanish colonization. So once different officers in the colonies, they keep arguing and writing, they said there are Portuguese here and they are probably Jews. So once they start telling the crown, reporting the crown, this is what is happening here. So we need an inquisition. That's pretty much what they're saying. And so the crown establishes tribunals of the Inquisition in the two capitals of the two main viceroyalties. And the Lima tribunal, the geographic span was too large for the tribunal, so they never completed a full visitation of the jurisdiction. They kept saying the territory is too big for us, even though they were not responsible for all the population, so they were only responsible for looking after Spaniards and Africans, Europeans and Africans, but not Native Americans. And Native Americans are excluded from the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. They're not going to be subjected to trials of faith because they had not been exposed to Christianity prior to the arrival of the Europeans to the New World. So even though it's not that they had to really look at the entire territory, they keep arguing that it's too big. It's like, this is too much for us. We cannot, there's no way we can cover this. And they keep arguing and they propose different locations for a third tribunal. So at some point they talk about Buenos Aires, but it's not accepted. At some point they talk, I think, Tucumán or Cordoba, other cities in what today is Argentina. And then at the end, what the crown decides is to establish another tribunal in Cartagena. Cartagena is an entry port for the slave trade, or is close to entry ports. So it makes sense because these are entry ports, and these are the ports through which people who are, targets of the Inquisition are coming through.
And that's in Colombia, right? Today's Colombia?
That's what today is Colombia, yes, Cartagena de Indias. So this tribunal is established a little bit later, but it's usually seen as a satellite to the Lima Tribunal.
So the Lima Tribunal is kind of the main one, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. It's the most important one, yeah, because it's the biggest one.
And I don't know if you mentioned what year. Do we know what year the Lima Tribunal was established?
1570.
Okay, so that's already, so like we said, but Lima's established in 1535, so it takes some time before they have the tribunal up and running, so to speak. So how does the Lima or the other ones as well, the Inquisitions, how are they alike or differ? Are they the same as the Spanish Inquisition? And you could talk about Spanish Inquisition's, procedures as well here. Do they operate the same exact way?
They have to follow the same procedures. The institution, that's also one of the surprises that I had while doing this research. We have this idea, at least I had this idea, of the Inquisition being totally irrational people who were out and about burning people alive. And I think that's the impression that we have. And one of the big surprises that I had, and my students have too, is that when I explained to them there was a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of procedures and regulations and manuals and inspections and letters, a lot of reporting of what they did and what they didn't, and consultation and votes to what to do. So it's a bureaucratic institution that was created throughout the Middle Ages, and it was kind of consolidated in Spain and in Portugal. But it was kind of a temporary and ad hoc tribunal in medieval Europe that was consolidated as a royal permanent established tribunal. In Spain in 1478, then in Portugal in 1536, and then in the Spanish colonies in 1570. Now, the tribunals in the colonies had to follow the same procedures, rules and procedures and what to do and how to do it is the same. What is different is what I just said about jurisdiction. because in Spain or in Portugal, they were looking after everyone. So hypothetically, a bishop or a king, anyone in the population could have been investigated by the Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula. Whereas in the New World, it's just Europeans and Africans. So that's the difference in who are they looking at. But the overall procedures are the same. They have to collect information. It's not arbitrary. We might think if it was unfair, if it was corrupt, or we can think if it is legitimate. But in the way they operated, they kept, all the information. So they had to collect denunciations or testimonies. They had to evaluate the information and assess whether the information was reliable or not. In the case of the Spanish Inquisition, they needed at least 2 witnesses to trigger an investigation of heresy. With one witness, they didn't move forward. They just collected the information. But then they needed the information, and they took several steps assessing the information. And once they thought the information was reliable, yes, this person is secret, in secrecy practicing Judaism or Islam or Protestantism. If they are practicing a hidden religion. Once they were convinced, then they launched the trial of faith, but not before. Now, once they launched the trial of faith, they didn't have the presumption of innocence. They pretty much decided that was the evidence was decided, and they thought the trial of faith was more kind of a space to confess and repent and ask for forgiveness. They were not thinking of a trial as a procedure to discover truth or not, which is the way we see a trial today. So it's some of the language is similar, but the framework is not the same of what we consider a trial today. But that's how they operated. Now, in that sense, it's the same tribunal. They have at least 2 inquisitors, preferably 3, but at least 2. So 2 inquisitors are listening, combining the interrogations and listening and in contact with the prisoners and deciding what needs to be done. And then they have notaries that record everything. They keep prisoners in isolation for the duration of the trial, so people are not, influenced by whatever is going on outside, and can also think and repent, ask for forgiveness, confess. They do property confiscations. There is an economic component. They do property confiscations during the process. They apply sentences according to how they process the information. They have to report, all the tribunals had to report to the Supreme Council of the Inquisition in Madrid. So this is a council that is one of the royal councils. So they have to report, and they have to send summaries of the cases they are processing. If they're going to apply death penalty, the lingo, it means release to the secular arm. That's the jargon of the Inquisition, but that's lingo, the euphemism for death at the stake. But if they arrive to this sentence, usually they have to get it approved by the main council. They're not now in the particular cases that I analyzed, they didn't. They rushed, and that's why they were, they were kind of sort of investigated afterwards in the bureaucracy. But the rules of the tribunal are the same. What historians try to understand is whether the tribunal was kind of efficient or it was lenient, dormant, if they took it seriously as they did in the peninsula. That would be one of the questions. And another question would be if the chronology, every tribunal that is active for 200 or 300 years, like these tribunals, the tribunals in Spain were active for around 350 years, from 1478 to 1830s. And in the colonies, 250 years, from 1570 to 1810s or 20s to the process of independence. So any tribunal that you study for 300 years is going to have peaks and lows, ups and downs of activity. Now, no tribunal will be equally active over time. So one of the questions that we had is if the tribunals, if the waves of activity echo the activities in the peninsula, and they don't. So they don't. So that's one of the things that we need to explain. Why inquisitors suddenly find heretics or don't, because part of it is related to what people do, and other part is related to what the policing body that you're analyzing. In this case, is the Inquisition, but what is going on? So is the ambition, is their careers, is their politics? So we have to put all of this in combination.
So we can get to answer those questions, and also there's a big case that a big story, which we'll get to, the Great Complicity of 1639. But before that, also, so some of that, what you were just saying, compared to the highs and lows, so to speak, of the Inquisition, have to do with maybe the amount of converso or crypto Jews. Obviously, there are no Jews allowed in South America at this point. It's a Spanish or Portuguese colonies. No Jews can be there, with the exception of the 17th century when the Dutch have, and the Dutch colonies, Dutch receive either in and out, and the Dutch colonies throughout the Atlantic, there's no Jews allowed. So you have, however, crypto Jews, conversos, as you said earlier. So do we know, I don't know if there's a good answer for how many were there, but I mean, do we know to what extent how many were there, and then how many trials are, I guess maybe you can see through the trials that how many people in these trials are being accused of being conversos or crypto Judaism? Because as you mentioned, and as listeners be familiar from other episodes, the Inquisition didn't only try crypto Judaism, it was any heresy to the church. So from the trials that you've looked at and these statistics in Lima, are you able to tell in any way?
Okay, so I can't, I'm just trying to put the answer in a different way. So they put under trial, there's no way for us to know how many conversos were there, because since they're officially not allowed to be there, we don't know. It's a cat and mouse, or a chicken and egg question. We cannot answer the question. So we can talk about, for instance, what I studied was like 110 trials from the 1630s. Sorry, I'm mixing up the chronology. So that's what I studied, and that's the moment where they realized that there's a huge network. But what we know by tracing down the bureaucracy of the Inquisition is that they know about this network before. So there's information of, the Maniosca, which was the big inquisitor that I located. He was trying to capture Juan Bautista Perez in the 1620s. 10 years before, he's trying to capture him, but he doesn't have enough evidence. But they know each other, they already know each other, and they're kind of moving around the kind of the colonial space. So I don't know how many conversos are there. I mean, there are scholars now, I think it's David Gitlis, there are some scholars who are talking about maybe 20,000 conversos, maybe 30,000 conversos in the entire Spanish colonies, all the Spanish colonies. But we're not sure. So when we find trials of faces, 1 or 2 or 5 individuals that are being caught for different reasons, and then you have like 100 that I found that are known. I mean, it's not that I'm not the first one who worked with this information, but like 100 or 110 in the 1630s, and then they kind of vanished from the record. And something similar happens in New Spain. So they have with the Carvajals, and then in the 1640s, so they have specific moments with those trials, but then we're not sure. No.
So before we get to one of those big trials, so what, as you mentioned, it's established in 1570, but the biggest case that you study we'll get to is in 1639. So what happens like in between? Before we get to that big case in 1639, is it quiet for a while? When does it start really seeing some more cases? What's happening in that time period?
They have in the 510, I think it's the case of Juan Vicente. They have different cases, but the cases seem more like individualized and isolated. So it really seems that they have a few people that they put in jail for the heresy of crypto Judaism. It is unclear why they're targeting these specific ones, because it seems they're more. They have, for instance, there's one case. I'm not sure if it's Juan Vicente or one of the other cases, that there's a different scholar, Nathan Bachtel from France, who also worked with these materials. Nathan Bachtel argues that one of the reasons is that the wife of one of these Portuguese crypto Jews or Portuguese Christians is having an affair with another bureaucrat. So probably that's the reason why they are capturing the husband. So it's really unclear in terms of a systemic action launched by the tribunal. It's more individual cases that might let you think that this was about religious orthodoxy and Christianity, and they see one and they think to put them in jail. In the cases of the complicity, what happens is that for once at this point the Portuguese New Christians are controlling big part of the trade in the city. So they are controlling big part of the credit. It's not only the trade in any commodities, the trade in African slaves, but also the credit, the banks and credit. So there's some competition with old Christians about, controlling the economy of the city. There is the issue of the ambition of the specific inquisitors. And there is the issue at that time, there's the issue of the kind of threat of the Dutch, piracy and also invasions around the continent. So they are considered suspicious of different things. Of being Jews is one, and that's the official charge. But they're also suspected of not being loyal to the king and making alliances with the Dutch. So as they capture, when they start capturing them, it's connected to, what we call Dutch Brazil, the presence of the Dutch in the tip of Brazil. But there's also information about the Dutch trying to capture the port of Buenos Aires, and there's also the Dutch trying to capture the port of Lima. So there's a concern about religion, but there's also a concern about politics.
Okay, so as you mentioned, this big case, and you just gave out the reasons why it occurs, is the Great Complicity, as it's called, between 1635, 1639. So just first of all, why are we calling it the Great Complicity? The Spanish title, you can say it in Spanish, I will try. Okay. Why is it called that?
It's called La Gran Complicidad. It's a big drizzle, very. This is how the Inquisition frames these type of cases. So they understand. It's very interesting to read the regulations of the Inquisition, because it tells you, how they saw crypto Jews. It's not only what they did or what they believed, it's how they saw them. So what they see, they understand that religion, it is an individual experience or expression, but they also understand that it's part of society, something that happens in a social setting. And they know that, they may not know the specifics of Judaism or what they were doing at that time, but they understand that usually if they find one, there's more. And they understand, they know what, they have some information of what the minion is or what the minion could have been. And once they find one person, once they had a clear information on one person, they start asking that person, were you alone? Are you practicing anything on your own? Are you talking to other people? Do you have any hidden ceremonies? Do you have any, collective ceremonies or collective exchanges? And once they start looking for this, and they know that this is through both family and professional networks, they start defining the cases not as one heretic, one person, un hereje, one prisoner. They start talking about complicity, because they think that this is a complicity that is challenging religion, but it's also challenging local political loyalties. So this is a time of, it's a society, Spain / Portugal. These are societies that have not only expelled Jews, they have also expelled Muslims. And they're not thinking about a society with diversity in terms of religion. They're thinking that, everyone is not only social, it's political, it's the loyalty to the king, because the king is also representative of Christianity. So if someone, takes a different route in terms of religion, it's also probably treason. It's somehow probably connected or potential to treason. It's very clear with Protestants, but it's also clear with Jews. So when they talk about complicity, it means that it's a group of people who are probably creating some sort of network for religious practice, but could also be a network for treason, political treason.
So how does this begin, this Great Complicity? I think it goes up to about 100 people. I think the correct number is wrong, which is a large amount. Like, usually these trials are small. This ends up being many trials. There's a lot of people, and it's going to end, spoiler alert, unfortunately, it's going to end in an auto de fe, which is terrible. We'll get to that. But how does it begin? There's this story, and it specifically starts kind of small, and then it like spreads out.
Yeah, it starts with Cordero, I think is the name. It starts with a store employee. It starts with a store employee who's working on a store that I believe they sell fabrics. You know, they sell muslin, regular fabric, and two customers go to the store and they find him eating an apple and they want to buy some fabric, and he says, the dependent on the store, he says that he's not going to charge them, he's not going to sell them anything because it's a Saturday, and he's not going to use money in a Saturday because neither his father didn't do it, so he's not going to do it. And that particular statement raises the alert because it's one of the markers. So when the Inquisition is trying to somehow educate people about what, who can or cannot be a crypto Jew and what is that they do, there are a couple of things that come to light that are done in a semi-public setting. One is that what people eat, whether, for instance, they eat pork or not. Pork is very present in the diet, in the regular diet of Iberian societies. So one is that what they eat, but the other one is the weekly calendar. So whether people rest on a Saturday because of Shabbat, or whether people rest on a Sunday, and it's whether they go or they don't go to mass, or whether they light candles on a Friday night, or whether they change linens or bed linens, whether they clean the house. What they do is the regular activities. So these are very specific behaviors that can raise the alarm. And what the Inquisition was doing is that either in mass or in an auto de fe or in any religious setting, they were issuing these, they're called edicts of grace or edicts of faith. They were reading out loud certain documents that were explaining how to recognize, who does what, and committing everyone to denounce. So back to what you asked me, the story is that two people went to buy something from a store where Cordero was working, and he said, I'm not going to sell you anything, or I'm not going to get your money today, something like this. I'm not going to touch your money. That created the suspicion that maybe this was a crypto Jew, because this was someone who, again, this is the 1630s. The conversions go back to 1492 and 1497. So these are people who 2 or 3 generations afterwards are preserving whatever fragments or whatever aspects of a Jewish practice that makes them distinguishable from the Catholic broader society. So the two customers either insisted or went back, and then they presented the denunciation, and that triggers the investigations. As I said before, the tribunal, once they had 2 denunciations, they would conduct investigations, and they start collecting information. And they start kind of putting together the pieces, and they start bringing them one at a time. And when they bring them in, they interrogate them. And one of the questions is, who else? Who did you talk to? Who shares your religious practices? And that's how it goes from 1 or 2 cases to, at some point, 110. So to the point that it supersedes the capacity of the prisons of the Inquisition. So they had 16 cells, and they ended up putting under trial around 100 or 110 people, more or less at the same time. So they needed more space.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how big these cells were. It doesn't seem like they were that big. It doesn't seem they're having that many trials. So what were these facilities like? And also, once you mentioned the cells, what was it like for the prisoners in these cells there in Lima?
The cells were very small, 2 meters by 2 meters, I would say. They were very, very small. These are the secret prisons. These are not the prisons for after the sentence. After the sentence, a prisoner could go to a regular prison, but before the sentence, there is a secret trial. So the cells, actually, you can visit the cells now. The buildings where the Lima Inquisition functioned have been located. They survived. The buildings survived and have been, to some extent, restored. So there is a museum. There's a museum of the Inquisition and Congress in Lima, and you can visit. And some of it, it's not. Some of it, the building exists, but it was repurposed by the Peruvian administration. But some of it has been restored, so you can have a sense of the cell. The cells were very small, 2 meters by 2 meters. There were terrible conditions. The tribunals had like a compound. So a compound that had the cells, the records, the offices of the inquisitors, the specific offices where they conducted hearings. Also a chapel where they could pray if they needed. But also they had the torture chambers. And also they had the rooms, some sort of a dormitory or room for at least one inquisitor, usually the senior one, because they anticipated that a prisoner could request a confession, could claim that he was repenting, and could request the presence of the inquisitors to confess at any time during the night, at any moment. And because the trials were secret, they wanted to prevent having to, transport prisoners from one place to the other in the city. So if the trial of the Inquisition was, people would be either summoned to appear in front of the tribunal or detained by the tribunal, but then no one knew what was happening until the auto de fe or until the end of the trial. So, and that was to prevent people running away, escaping from the Inquisition, etc., to keep the possibility of capturing more people.
So you mentioned auto de fe and the outcome of the trial. So what happened in these trials, and then the outcome is auto de fe? They didn't always end in auto de fe, right? But here, seemingly, a lot of them did. And how many ended up by the auto de fe?
Yeah. So the auto de fe is kind of the end of the trial. This is when they issue the sentence, but not they have auto de fe of kind of different sizes. So sometimes it's a private ceremony for 1 or 2 people. They not always have this large, theatrical ceremony. That's an innovation of the Spanish Inquisition. The medieval Inquisition didn't have this kind of theatrical punishment, but the Spanish Inquisition does, and it becomes part of the rituals of the monarchy. So the monarchy is there. It's a big, big, big ceremony. And so in this particular case, they had an auto de fe with around 70 people that received punishment, but that doesn't equal death at the stake for everyone. So 70 people or 72 people received punishment, and probably 10 or 11 had sentences of release to the secular arm, which means death at the stake. So in the overall analysis of statistics, the Inquisition released or burned at the stake relatively few people, around close to 2 per 100 prisoners. So the percentages are small. Now, because it was done in a public theatrical setting with a lot of pomp and a big ceremonial, I think that the low numbers are not the only way in which we can understand the historical significance, because it's burning on the stake, what that means, but it's also done in public. It's 1 or 2 months in advance, they announce this to the entire city, and they build the stage, and they have benches, and they have processions, and they try to get as much as the local population to attend and to be present and to be the spectators of the application of punishment. So that's how it ends, in the big auto de fe. So that auto de fe was so large that the information arrived to Spain or to the communities in the old world too, because it was terrible. So they burned 10 people. It's terrible. 10 or 11 people.
Yeah, I mean, I think you outline in the book even more in depth the whole ceremony. What does auto de fe mean?
Auto de fe, it means act of faith in the literal translation. it's just that because in contemporary Spanish, auto means car. I know that. It's my first language, so it's really, if you are not familiar with the terminology, it's just like, what? Auto, car or faith, it's really not something that makes sense to us. But auto de fe is more like act of faith. I think that the act of faith is a more accurate translation in English. Now, in Spanish, the word auto, if you analyze colonial information or early modern history, and even today in certain cases, sometimes autos it's a legal term that is, written down in what we would call in English, it would be either proceedings or minutes, which is, written down in a very particular lingo that records certain procedures, that it's supposed to be done in a certain way, and it's done in the way that it's supposed to be done. So that's part of the phrasing too. Escrito en autos, listado en autos. So auto de fe comes from this. It's just that because auto is automobile, car is such a confusion, but it's act of faith. It's a public act of faith. I think that's a more accurate translation to English.
So you mentioned there's about 10 burned at the stake, but there were, like you mentioned, there was 70 sentenced. So what happens to the other ones if they're not burned at the stake?
If they're not burned at the stake, it means they're reconciled, and it means that they're offered a second chance. They're given a second chance. So they're reconciled to, let's say, the Christian community. So this is the time I said that before, that Christianity is more than a religion. Christianity is the national identity, and the heretic, is deviating or is offending. It's a crime and a sin. So it's offending the religion, but also the community. So reconciliation means the opportunity to come back and to reconcile with the community. So these are people who they're not going to be killed. These are people who have to abjure. So they have to read a statement of abjuration that it's kind of a template, I so-and-so admit that I did this, or I believed in that. And they have to promise, they have to recognize in public, it's public humiliation. They have to recognize the heresy, that they kind of lied to the rest of the community because they preserved the heathen religiosity, even knowing that it was forbidden. So they have to admit that they were guilty, meaning the tribunal was correct in putting them under trial. They have to promise to never, relapse, to never go back to heresy, and to be a good Christian, to embrace the Christian church. They have to also promise to be a good Christian and to cooperate with the Inquisition, denouncing other people. And they also have to promise to keep secrecy about the procedures of the Inquisition or what they experienced. So they have to read such a statement in public. And then sometimes they also have other penalties. So they can or cannot, it depends, the Inquisition has like a lot of options in terms of penalties, and then they decide what to do in specific cases according to the trial, but also according to the reaction of the prisoner or the broader context. But they can be subjected to property confiscation, and they can be subjected to physical, lashes or different type of physical punishments. They can be subjected to exile, prohibition of residing in the city where they're from, forced exile, or the opposite. They can be, for instance, there's a case that is prior to the ones I analyzed. The father of Maldonado da Silva. There's a case from the 1620s. He was a physician who was a Portuguese physician who lived in the south of Chile, and he was captured and sent to Lima for an Inquisition trial. And he, in the auto de fe, he's not allowed to ever see his family again, I think, or to go back to his own town. But he's sent to be the physician at either a local convent or a local orphanage in Lima. So he's sent there until the end of his days to be the physician. Then other people are told, for instance, they use derogatory garments. They're called sanbenitos or abitello in Italian. These are derogatory garments. It's kind of a robe that is usually in color orange or yellow or maybe white or red, depending on with decoration of flames. That this is garment that allows them to be exposed. So in some cases, they wear these derogatory garments for the auto de fe. But if they're burned at the stake, this is their last garment, and the garment is exposed at the church for generations to come, to kind of shame the family. But if they're reconciled, sometimes one of the penalties could be that they have to wear the San Benito, the derogatory garment, for 1 year, for 5 years, till the end of their lives. It depends. So they're always going to be identified as a heretic. The penalties are tough. So then that's one of the things that I question in my book in historiographical discussions, that the number of people they killed are really low. And that's very important, I think, to know, and to shift the idea that the Inquisition was some irrational priests burning people up and down. So I think that it's very important to understand what they did or how they saw it, and to understand historically. So the numbers are low, but the penalties are so harsh. Even the ones who are not burned, the penalties are so harsh that they really, really affect human life.
As I was going to say, not only the penalty source, it's the fear of the penalties. So what happened to the community here after these mass trials of 110 people after 1639? Well, I can only imagine what happens to the community.
We don't know. There's a lot that we don't know, because the community is visible through the trials. So some of them, if they were single and if they didn't have their own families, so their lives are kind of vanished. If there's few cases of women, so some of the women get also punished in the auto de fe. There's some information about them. For instance, there's one case that scholars from Spain could trace down what happened. For instance, there are two people who survived the auto de fe, a man and a woman, who are reconciled, and then exile is part of the sentence. Exile from Lima, exile from Peru. And somehow they go back to Seville, they go back to Spain, and there is information that they went back to Seville and they married each other. So the two of them had lost the original husband and wife in Lima, in the burnings in Lima, and they end their lives in Seville married to each other. But the information is very difficult to follow. And then there's the others who there is information that they're in Panama, again, trying to go to Seville, but they're difficult to trace down. Then there's information that I found that I mentioned to you before. There's information, at least the widow of one of the people who were burned was left in total poverty. So she had 4 children. Her husband was the biggest merchant in Lima. And he is not only that he was considered, there are documents that say that he was the rabbi of the community. He was the one conducting some sort of clandestine services. But he was burned. His entire, his properties, his assets were confiscated, and the widow is left in absolute poverty. And what I know is that at some point she writes an appeal to the Inquisition, appealing for a pension, not appealing for the sentence. But I haven't read that particular document yet, so I don't know. But back to your question, the paradox of this information is that it's a clandestine community, or a clandestine group of people, or individual or isolated people. So we only know about them when they're being caught. And if not, then we don't know. And then the question is if they are, if there are people today who claim that they are the descendants of crypto Jews in the colonial period. That's a different question. So.
Now, how about the Inquisition? This is, I imagine, the height of the Inquisition. Like you said, those highs and lows, those peaks. What happens to the Lima Inquisition after these cases, this Great Complicity of 1635-39?
They pretty much don't have a lot of activity. They have kind of isolated cases. So they have some isolated cases of crypto Jews and some of Protestants, or some of women, let's say sorcery or some other penalty. But what we know is that with the Great Complicity, there's property, as I said, there's property confiscation. So according to the regulations of the Inquisition, when there is property confiscation, part of it goes to the tribunal that conducted the trials, And part of it goes to the Supreme Council of the Inquisition in Madrid, and probably part goes also to the monarchy, because there are, it's big transfer of property. So what the material says is that after these trials, the Inquisition was pretty much financially self-sufficient. The Inquisition is an institution that, because it has property confiscations, the economy of the Inquisition is a combination of subsidies from the crown, but also what they obtain from property confiscations. So the tribunal is financially stable and financially well until abolition. So they exist, the tribunal exists, and they are there, but they're not particularly active, which begs the question for historians. We don't know. Is that the potential, crypto-Jewish community was terrified after this autos de fe, and there's no more crypto-Jewish activity in Lima because they are terrified of another set of trials? Or is it that because the tribunal was financially set, they were not particularly concerned with being efficient in their own activities? It becomes kind of a more formal or dormant tribunal, lenient tribunal. They are there, they exist, but they're not, looking for information all the time. They don't seem to be actively, spying and trying to generate trials. That's what happens. So the tribunal is kind of there, but not super active.
Now, these sources that you looked at, are they located in Lima, they're in Peru, or are they in Spain, in Madrid?
In Madrid. So the materials were in the Lima Tribunal. The Lima Tribunal was the one who collected information, but there are different things that happen, and one of them is that the materials, this is a war that happened after everything. So in the 1870s, I believe, this is a War of the Pacific. This is Peru, Chile, and Bolivia. This is a terrible war in which Chile invaded part of Peru, and part of they got up to Lima. So part of they did was destroying part of the archives and then capturing part of the archives and taking part of the information to Chile. So some of the information is in Chile. The information that is in Chile is the information about property confiscations, so the financial information. So any scholar who wants to work with that information can today, it's public archive in Chile and at Archivo Histórico, which is in Santiago. Now, the records of the trials, the Inquisition in general was very organized in terms of bureaucracy. So they wrote down, the obsession to write down everything they did is what creates this information for us, for historians. So they had to write down what they were doing, and they had to report to the Supreme Council in Madrid. And they also transcribed unusual cases. And so what survived is the full transcription of unusual cases that is located in Madrid, and the reports that they send, which comes with summaries of the cases, and update is every twice a year or once a year or every other year, whatever periodificate, whatever rhythm they had. So they would have to, the case of so and so, this is what happened, and the case of so and so, this is what happened, creating some sort of a ledger with information. The tribunal in Madrid, because it's a royal tribunal, so the national archives, which are also the archives of the monarchy, this is in Madrid, and this is information that can be consulted. I had fantastic access to the information. So now big part of it is online, is available online, has been scanned. Now you have to not only know Spanish, you have to be able to read 17th century Spanish. So a big part of the information is now available online as PDFs, but I did my research before. So I went to Lima. It's public access. You need, an ID or passport. You need a letter from the institution you're working with, explaining that you have a proposal and maybe a research proposal. Maybe they ask you, okay, can you give us a copy of your research proposal, and what kind of materials are you going to be looking for? And they would take a picture of you, so to do some sort of ID to access the archives, and they give you an ID, and then you can work there. It was very, very accessible for all scholars, so scholars from the entire world, so not only from scholars of Spain, so scholars from everywhere.
Very interesting. And it's just interesting to hear about the Lima Inquisition, the South American Inquisition in general. So I'll link to the book in the show's notes for those who want to read more about these specific cases and people involved, and just more in detail about what we discussed. Are there any other works on the Lima Inquisition or in general in the South American Inquisition or the converso, the crypto-Jewish communities of South America that you would recommend?
Yeah, I recommend the work of Nathan Wachtel, because I think he worked with some of the cases that I worked, but he presented the work in a different way. So I think, and then I'm thinking I'm now working on I'm now working on a volume on a dossier, so I can't because this hasn't been published yet. With colleagues of mine who are working on the Lima Inquisition and in the Inquisition South America. So that's work that doesn't exist yet. And I wonder if there's a movie, there's a documentary that I have to give you the title in a minute because I cannot remember the exact. It's gonna be bad because I don't remember the exact title now. Silvina Bomb. Okay, so what I was going to recommend to you is this is a movie that is done by Gabriela Bom. This is an Argentine movie maker, and the movie is called The Longing, the Forgotten Jews of South America. And this is about a group of small groups of people in South America who are claiming that they are the descendants and their ancestry is of New Christians and crypto Jews in the colonial world, but in the 1990s or in the 2000s, they know this is their ancestry. Now, they have been converted to Christianity, in the 1482, 1487, their families, and they're claiming to come and they want to come back to a Jewish practice and to a Jewish community. So the film is a documentary and it brings historical information, but it follows them in their quest. And it explains how they feel, how they relate to each other, what they know, and how do they know about this. But it also shows what happens with the local Jewish communities, how they relate to the local Jewish communities. And it also brings information about a rabbi. And I said, I don't know why I'm thinking Texas, but it's the U.S. South. It's a Reformed rabbi who is in contact with them, who's sending them materials, who's traveling to meet with them, and is performing ceremonies of reconversion back to Judaism. And they stay at the end of the movie, what is shown is that they stay in touch because he can guide them or he can provide them support to keep going with their own new Jewish practice. So I think that's because most of the work, most of the material I work with is academic work or academic books. So, and what I always say to my students is that sometimes the material is too dry unless you are in the profession, because it takes a while to kind of picture what was going on. Now, all the movies that we know about the Inquisition, they're Hollywood movies, and Hollywood has a particular way of distorting things to make them more theatrical or to follow the canons of commercial cinema. So, but this is a documentary that really follows the stories, and I think it's fantastic because you see, they tell the stories, they tell their experiences, their pain and their frustration, and what they want and how they feel a connection to Judaism 500 years later, and how they interact again with the local communities. And I think that's a movie that is really very interesting for anyone, no matter if you are in the world of scholarship or not.
Very interesting. Okay, so I'll put again your book, the other book, Wachtel, the book has been translated into English. I'll put that in the show's notes, and the documentary you sent me the link, I'll put it in there as well. And so with that, thank you, Professor Schaposchnik, for coming on the podcast to discuss the Lima Inquisition and to talk about South America and Inquisition and crypto Judaism.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. And I hope I said that to you. I hope I didn't speak too fast, and I hope my accent is still understandable for everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you. I think so. Hopefully the listeners think so as well.